Hi everyone, it's William here with the Grand Duke Dmitri 1917 diary series. Today we'll be doing the second part of the long diary entry of November 17th, 1917, of course, and we have some really fascinating material on what's going on in Russia and what Dmitri thinks about it. Our recap for the first section of that long diary entry, Dmitri was convinced that the rumors were wrong, that there was an opposition government in Moscow opposing the Bolsheviks. He was satisfied that that was not the case. I mean, not satisfied in the sense that he was happy about it, God forbid anything, but he was satisfied that the information that he had confirmed that. He talked about rumors that General Kaledin, who was the ataman of the Don Cossacks, was moving on both the capitals with his Cossacks. That was not the case, but Kaledin was indeed organizing his Don Cossacks, who would be a big factor in the Civil War that was coming soon. He was upset by what he considered Kerensky's dereliction of duty, that Kerensky, who'd been the head of the provisional government, had sort of just quietly slipped away, and Dmitri, expressing a military officer's point of view, was bothered by that someone would abandon his post, someone who had only recently told the Russian soldiers, look, you can't abandon your posts. You know your honor is on the line. You need to stay and fight. Well, and then Kerensky slipped away himself. He wasn't a military man, but, Dmitri in that instance was definitely representing the military point of view. Okay, so let's dive into today's text. Here we go. If one now tries to imagine what's happening in Russia, one must arrive at the conviction that it's simply chaos there and the beginning of a civil war. Apparently, the Maximalists have run into difficulties right at the beginning. For example, the staff in the ministries are not fulfilling the orders of the ministers. The Bolshevik government itself is not recognized by the Allies. The situation has truly become terrible. And meanwhile, the financial barometer is rising because the ruble went up again in London. I personally cannot imagine what will happen now. The Bolsheviks have energetically taken up their program. They have ordered units at the front to choose representatives to negotiate peace with the Germans standing opposite them. Yesterday I saw Colonel Napier, who's the military agent to the mission in Teheran. He was very much abashed by what's going on with us from a military perspective. Then Lenin, who is now calling himself the People's Commissar, ordered General Dukhonin, the Chief of Staff of the High Command, to enter quickly into peace negotiations with our foes, and, if he doesn't consent to that, to resign his post in favor of Ensign Krylenko. I am attaching the telegram, which was passed along to me by Etter. For some reason, je ne prends pas le maximaliste au sérieux. But apparently they have set about affairs terribly quickly and are energetically implementing a pacifistic program. Of course, Dukhonin's refusal to fulfill Lenin's demand will lead to new complications, and the question of whether he will be able to resist Lenin and company. It's a matter that depends on the mood of the troops. I greatly fear that the majority of our titans will be on the side of the Bolsheviks, because their ideas promise the unconscious person much more than the abstract concept of patriotism and love of one's motherland. Exclamation point. Okay, lots to get into here. I will say that I'm not sure when he uses the French. In the original, in Dmitri's actual diary entry, it looks like, for some reason, I in Russian, ne prends pas le maximaliste au sérieux. So it looks like, for some reason, I don't take the maximalists seriously. And I'm not sure. It seems to me like he is taking them seriously. Maybe the I is, maybe it's a scribble that I didn't perceive correctly, and maybe he's saying that Etter is not taking the maximalists seriously, but it could be that he's saying he's not when it comes to a separate piece. Anyway, sorry about that little sidetrack there. So let's go back to the start and talk about what's going on. Well, he mentions internal problems for the Bolsheviks, that the ministers, basically Trotsky and Lenin, as Dmitri mentioned before, had taken over the functions of all the ministers, but the staff, the employees at the ministries were not cooperating, apparently, were not going along. So what could you do? You try to start a government within a few weeks' time. You need people who know what they're doing. That's just a simple practical consideration. If you're geared toward leading the revolution and opposing the government that's in place, and then all of a sudden you're the government yourself, you may not be prepared for that. And they managed to pull it off, I have to say. But I'm sure what Dmitri was saying was right, that they were meeting a fair amount of resistance amongst the people who were already in place and running the government, the lower level people. Anyway, yeah, you need the people who know how to run things. I don't know what Dmitri doesn't say what his source of information is about the difficulties that the Bolsheviks were meeting with governing, but it's sounds accurate to me. Dmitri, of course, is quite right to predict that a civil war is imminent. I think, though, that is something anybody would have said at that time. Okay, the situation has become terrible, he says. So that's an interesting statement. What does that mean? It almost sounds as though he wishes the Bolsheviks were better organized. The ministers, the ministries aren't responding to them. I don't know. That's probably not what he means, but it's just a flat out. The Bolshevik government is not recognized by the Allies. The ministries are not fulfilling the orders of the minister. The situation has become terrible. So terrible for the Bolsheviks. But is he implying that it's terrible for Russia too? I mean, probably in a broad sense. Okay. Yeah. His former belief that he was so certain that the fact that the ruble was rising on the exchange in London meant that the Bolsheviks were failing. He clearly no longer believes that. I don't think his information is even accurate from what I've seen about the ruble rising against the pound sterling. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. He simply no longer believes that a rising ruble indicates failing Bolsheviks. Okay, the next thing that caught my eye was that the Bolsheviks had ordered the units at the front to negotiate with the Germans that were literally standing opposite them. If you were on the front and say you were a cavalry unit or an infantry unit, at that micro level, you're supposed to go and negotiate with the people directly across from you, not government to government, so to speak. So I think that's interesting. I wonder if that happened anywhere along the front lines. Colonel Napier, he identifies for us as a military agent at the mission, a military attaché at the British legation in Tehran, and he has he has great concerns that Russia is going to be pulling out of the alliance, which indeed we know that it would be. And so, his concerns were fully justified. It interests me that Dmitri is talking to all these people, and they're talking to him. They're not withholding information from him. Etter, even though he's, in this awkward position of sort of being answerable to the Bolsheviks as the Russian minister in Tehran, they're all giving information to Dmitri, or so it seems. If they were withholding anything, I guess it's impossible for me to say, but they seem to have been quite willing to talk to him, and he was certainly, trying to get all the information he could and interpret it on his own. Okay, so here we come to the most interesting part of this, and this is General Dukhonin, Nikolai Nikolaevich Dukhonin. He was only 40 years old at that time. He had been an important but relatively unknown general. He had, been a career officer with an intelligence background. That was where he had been most active within the army. And he had become quartermaster general of the Southwest Front, and chief of staff after Alexeyev, who chief of staff at that time was essentially the supreme commander of all the forces when Alexeyev had stepped down, who'd been in place under Nicholas as chief of staff. Dukhonin had been sort of plucked out at Alexeyev's recommendation as a career officer who could do this job. But now Lenin and the Bolsheviks were telling him, look, you have to immediately enter into peace negotiations with the Germans, government to government, commander to commander, supreme commander to supreme commander, or step down. And so Dmitri, it's not clear from the way he puts it if he'd already gotten the news that Dukhonin had stepped down, or he was just simply convinced that Dukhonin would step down. Dukhonin did step down. And when he did step down, he was killed by a mob of soldiers, sort of ripped apart and stabbed with bayonets and killed by a mob of soldiers. That obviously hasn't happened yet. And he was replaced by this man whom Dmitri calls Ensign Krylenko. I don't know where the stress is on that name. It's a Ukrainian name, Krylenko, I don't know. But anyway, this was a very, very sinister figure. This was a man who had been a Bolshevik since he was at university. He'd been involved with the organized part of the October 1905 revolution that failed, but was highly organized. It wasn't just sort of a spontaneous revolution. He'd been a Bolshevik already back then and already very active. The Russian government really hadn't done as much as they should have to quash this guy, because he was a really sinister figure. But he was arrested at various times, and then they'd release him, and he'd go abroad, come back, he'd be arrested again. And at this time, Dmitri identifies him as an ensign. He wasn't a military officer, but he was subject to the draft in Russia. And so he had been arrested and forced to enter the military, and apparently he'd received the rank of ensign. He wasn't put in among the lower ranks. He was given an officer's rank, which is interesting. His background was that he had a degree from the University of St. Petersburg, I think, in history and literature, so definitely not a career soldier at all. He was an ensign on the Southwest Front, and I don't know why Lenin and Trotsky and the Bolsheviks decided to put this guy in charge of the entire army. I guess it really didn't matter that much who the supreme commander was at that moment, since all they wanted to do was withdraw from the war and negotiate the peace. But this is very interesting and perceptive, what Dmitri says. Of course, Dukhonin's refusal to fulfill Lenin's demand will lead to new complications. The question of whether he will be able to resist, it's a matter that depends on the mood of the troops. So Dmitri was, he was getting really good information, and he was a smart guy in interpreting it, because that's exactly what happened. It did depend on the mood of the troops, and he wasn't able to resist. He had to step down because the troops weren't going to put up with his presence any longer. And indeed, as I said, they ripped him to pieces. They killed the man. That I think was quite astute on Dmitri's part. He refers to the Russian troops as our Titans, obviously sarcastically. I greatly fear that the majority of our Titans will be on the side of the Bolsheviks. And again, it's very interesting why he assumes that. And, not just why, because everybody knew that they were being offered the sun and the moon by the Bolsheviks to to side with the Bolsheviks. But the way he puts it, the unconscious person Their ideas promise the unconscious person much more than the abstract concept of patriotism and love of one's motherland. And you know, it really was an abstract concept. For the soldiers who'd been drawn straight from the peasantry. And the peasantry was so focused on the land, and they didn't really have, even at this point, a strong concept of Russia as a nation. And so, you know, Mother Russia, yes, and I'm sure there was love of the motherland, but Dmitri's right in saying that it wasn't at the abstract level of patriotism, of this idea of the nation and what makes up a nation. It was not that at all. And when you juxtapose that with, you know, how terrible your life has been since the war started, and the centuries-long thirst of the Russian peasantry to have the land, then yeah, those are very concrete things. Then patriotism does become a kind of abstract concept. So yeah, fascinating material. I'll finish up just by saying that, yeah, next time Dmitri will be talking more in depth about the troops and these various things that are motivating them and his assessment of them. Yeah, and making a very surprising statement. I'm not going to say more than that, but I hope to see you then. All right, bye.